Have you ever been told that someone you loved was gone, and in the very same breath that you no longer mattered? Have you ever felt grief arrive not with compassion, but with certainty? Because when my phone rang that night, my brother didn't ask how I was, didn't lower his voice, didn't give me a moment to prepare. He said it plainly, almost proudly. Mom died last night. I inherited everything. You get nothing. That was it.
No pause. No sympathy.
Just a sentence meant to close a door forever. I stood there holding the phone, still warm against my ear, trying to understand how death and dismissal could be delivered so cleanly, so efficiently, like a final transaction. For a few seconds, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt small, reduced, as if years of showing up, years of loyalty, had just been overwritten by someone else's confidence. And that's when it hit me. The deepest betrayals aren't shouted. They're delivered calmly by people who believe the outcome is already sealed. I had always believed that family meant fairness, that respect naturally followed responsibility, that being dependable would one day be acknowledged without needing to ask for it. Standing there in silence, I realized how dangerous those beliefs can be when someone else has been quietly keeping score in a very different way. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't defend myself. I simply listened to the certainty in his voice and noticed something about it that didn't sit right. Felt rushed, rehearsed, as if he needed me to accept it quickly before something could surface. That's when my thoughts drifted, not dramatically, but steadily, to the years before that call. To hospital corridors I walked alone. To paperwork I handled without discussion. To the small, uncomfortable responsibilities that never seemed to interest him. And a question formed that I couldn't ignore anymore. If I was the one who stayed, who handled things when they got hard, how could I be left with nothing? The answer didn't come all at once, but the doubt did, and it was enough to change how I stood there, how I breathed, how I understood that moment. Because people who truly have nothing to hide don't rush to announce victory, and people telling the whole truth don't sound like they're afraid of silence. The smile that came then wasn't joy, it was restraint. It was the kind of smile you feel when you stop reacting and start observing, when you realize the story you've been told might not be the story that survives. I ended the call politely. Then I stood there longer than I cared to admit, letting grief settle where it belonged, while something else quietly took shape beside it. The understanding that whatever he thought he had secured that night, it wasn't final, and the truth has a way of revisiting people who celebrate too early. The morning after that call, I was the one standing in line at the records office, holding forms I never expected to fill out alone, while my brother sent a short message saying he was handling things remotely. That was the first concrete moment when something shifted, because grief is one thing, but responsibility has weight, and I felt it settle squarely on my shoulders again, just like it always had. The days that followed moved strangely, busy, quiet, and heavy all at once, as I made arrangements, returned calls, and answered questions no one seemed to think to direct to both of us. These were the things no one applauds, the unspoken labor that happens when loss becomes logistical, and I noticed how naturally I fell into that role while he stayed just far enough away to appear involved without being burdened. When the service came, he arrived polished and composed, accepting condolences with practiced ease, while I stood slightly to the side, listening more than speaking, watching how people responded to certainty even when it felt misplaced. And in that space, surrounded by familiar faces and shared memories, an uncomfortable thought began to surface. The version of events I'd been handed didn't match the life I had lived alongside my mother. I remembered late conversations where she worried aloud about fairness, not money, but balance, about how silence between siblings can last longer than arguments if things are left unsaid. I remembered her asking me to hold on to certain papers, just in case. The way she framed questions about decisions as if she were double-checking something rather than announcing it. None of it felt dramatic at the time, which is why it stayed buried. But grief has a way of clearing space for details you once ignored. I didn't call my brother to challenge him. I didn't ask for proof. I didn't even let my tone change, because I've learned that people who believe they've secured everything rarely guard themselves against what they think no longer matters. Instead, I watched. I noticed how confident he sounded when others were listening and how careful he became when conversations turned specific. I noticed how often he redirected questions, how quickly he shut down discussions about timing or documentation, how frequently he checked his phone as if waiting for reassurance. And a simple question lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. If nothing was wrong, why did everything feel so carefully managed? That question changed the shape of my grief. It turned sorrow into attention, pain into patience. I realized I wasn't being erased, I was being underestimated. And by the end of that week, as routines began to return and condolences faded, one thing became unmistakably clear. This was no longer about loss alone. Something had been set in motion, and the person who thought the story was finished had no idea it was only just beginning. The first real crack didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived officially, which made it impossible to dismiss. A clerk called to confirm a detail I hadn't asked about yet, using my name instead of his, and when I corrected her, there was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you someone is double-checking something they assumed was settled. She explained, carefully now, that several filings listed me as the primary point of contact and that before anything could move forward, a clarification would be required. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat there for a long moment, not feeling relief or excitement, but something steadier, direction. That call changed the texture of everything. Until then, my brother's certainty had lived in conversations and assumptions. Now it had collided with process. I went back through what I had kept over the years, the envelopes my mother insisted I hold on to, the notes she wrote in plain language, never emotional, never vague, just deliberate. They didn't announce anything on their own, but together they formed a pattern that didn't match the outcome my brother had declared so confidently. And for the first time, I understood why she had been so careful without ever explaining herself. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't even mention the call. Instead, I listened more closely when we spoke, noticing how his explanations came faster now, how he volunteered reassurance without being asked, how often he repeated that everything was already handled. People who are secure don't do that. Around the same time, a delay surfaced, small, procedural, but undeniable. A form couldn't be finalized. A signature was questioned. A request was paused pending review. Nothing collapsed outright, but the momentum he relied on slowed, and I could hear it in his voice the next time we spoke, the faint irritation beneath the confidence, the way certainty had begun to strain. What mattered wasn't the delay itself, it was who caused it. It wasn't me. It was the system, and systems don't respond to pressure or charm. They respond to accuracy. That's when I stopped thinking of this as a misunderstanding and started seeing it for what it was. A plan built on speed, counting on silence and compliance to outrun scrutiny. I didn't step in to stop it. I didn't need to. All I had to do was remain exactly where I was, calm, present, documented. When uncertainty finally crept into his voice during an ordinary conversation, just for a second, it confirmed everything. He hadn't anticipated resistance because he hadn't anticipated review. And as I ended that call, aware now that external eyes were quietly entering a story he believed was finished, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about waiting for the truth to surface. It was about watching what happens when confidence meets verification. The shift became impossible to ignore the day an official letter arrived instead of another phone call, addressed to both of us, requesting clarification before anything further could proceed. It was brief and formal, signed by a name I didn't recognize, but the language carried weight, the kind that doesn't accuse and doesn't reassure either. I read it slowly at the kitchen table, noticing how often the word pending appeared, how carefully every sentence avoided assumption. When I forwarded it to my brother without adding a word of my own, his response came back almost immediately, asking what I had told them, as if silence itself had suddenly become a liability. I told him the truth, that I hadn't said anything at all, and the pause that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. A few days later, a clerk called to walk through the next steps, her tone professional but deliberate, explaining that certain matters couldn't move forward without direct confirmation. She spoke as if time were no longer flexible, and when she asked questions, they weren't aimed at me or him personally. They were aimed at the record. From that point on, his confidence began to thin. He called more often, asked questions that circled the same points, repeated that delays were routine, though his voice suggested otherwise. Meanwhile, the process slowed in visible ways. Forms were returned with notes attached. Timelines that had once been spoken about casually were now undefined. Someone, somewhere, was reading carefully, and that alone was enough to interrupt a plan built on speed. When I was asked to provide copies of documents I had held onto for years, it wasn't framed as a favor or a challenge. It was framed as necessity, because my name was already there, quietly embedded where it mattered. Handing them over didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like following through on something my mother had anticipated without ever needing to explain. Each step forward drew a reaction from my brother that became harder to disguise. Patience edged with irritation, reassurance laced with urgency, a growing need to manage conversations he once controlled effortlessly. The moment that stayed with me came during a short meeting call, when an official paused, reviewed a detail, and said they needed to verify one more thing before proceeding. My brother sighed audibly and said it was unnecessary, that they were overthinking it. And in that instant, I understood how unfamiliar scrutiny was to him. For me, it wasn't unfamiliar at all. It was how I had lived most of my life, carefully, without shortcuts, knowing that clarity eventually favors those who wait. As the pause stretched into weeks and certainty gave way to procedure, one truth settled with quiet finality. This was no longer about who spoke first or loudest. The process itself had taken control, and it was doing what no confrontation ever could, forcing the truth to stand still long enough to be seen. Pressure doesn't always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as inconvenience that refuses to resolve, and that's when the difference between preparation and assumption becomes visible. The first time I felt it shift beyond theory was during a short review meeting held in a quiet office with neutral walls and a long table that made no effort to feel welcoming. An official read through a section of the record aloud, slowly, then stopped, looked up, and asked a simple question that no one rushed to answer. The pause that followed wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable, the kind that tells you something has just lost its footing. When the conversation resumed, the tone had changed, less forward-moving, more deliberate, and I understood then that what had been automatic for my brother was now conditional. Outside that room, the effects became harder for him to hide. A transfer he had spoken about as imminent didn't happen. A commitment he'd already accounted for now required revision. He asked me, more than once, whether I'd heard anything new, whether these reviews usually took this long, whether I thought they were digging. I answered briefly, truthfully, and without reassurance, and each calm response seemed to unsettle him more than confrontation ever could. Meanwhile, people began redirecting questions, not toward him, but toward the documentation, toward timelines, toward confirmation. That change was subtle but irreversible. Authority wasn't withdrawing. It was recalibrating, and he felt it. His patience thinned. His confidence lost its edge. He pushed for speed where speed was no longer possible, and that impatience started costing him credibility in rooms where certainty used to be enough. The moment that stayed with me came later, during a routine call, when an official stated plainly that no further steps would be taken until all discrepancies were resolved. My brother agreed too quickly, his voice tight, as if compliance were something he needed to demonstrate rather than assume. When the call ended, there was no argument, no accusation, no raised voices, just a silence that felt different than before. This one wasn't waiting, it was closing, and as I sat there afterward, aware that timelines had stopped moving forward and were now folding inward under review, I understood what had finally broken. Not the process, not the record, but his belief that momentum alone could carry him through. Whatever outcome remained was now a matter of determination, not persuasion. And for the first time since that call on the night my mother died, I knew the next decision would not belong to him. The determination didn't arrive with a verdict spoken aloud or a moment anyone could dramatize. It arrived as a conclusion written carefully enough that it didn't need emphasis. I was notified of a final review meeting, brief and procedural, where the purpose was no longer to clarify but to confirm, and walking into that room I felt none of the tension I once associated with conflict. Only a steady awareness that whatever happened next would be grounded in record, not reaction. The official leading the discussion summarized the findings in a voice designed to be neutral, referencing dates, signatures, and intentions that had been preserved without commentary. And as each point was read, I watched my brother grow quieter, not defensive, not argumentative, just still. When the conclusion was stated, that the distribution could not proceed as previously assumed, that prior representations were inaccurate, and that the documented intentions would be honored instead, there was no pause for response, no opening for persuasion. It wasn't framed as correction or punishment. It was framed as alignment. The process had finished what patience had started. My brother nodded once, too quickly, as if agreement might soften the finality of what had just been confirmed, but nothing in the room shifted. Questions were limited to logistics now, timelines adjusted, next steps outlined without urgency. When it ended, people gathered their papers and moved on with practiced indifference, because for them it was one case among many. For him, it was the moment certainty gave way to record. Outside, he tried to speak casually, mentioned how unexpected the outcome was, how complicated things had become, and I listened without correcting him, without reminding him of the confidence he'd once carried so easily. There was no need. The reversal didn't require acknowledgement to be real. What mattered had already been decided. In the days that followed, the change became visible in small, unignorable ways. Plans quietly undone, assumptions revised, explanations offered where none had been required before. I wasn't asked to justify anything. I wasn't asked to forgive or reconcile or explain how I felt. The process didn't care about any of that. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. Slow everything down until the truth could no longer be outrun. And in that stillness, I felt something settle that wasn't victory or relief, but resolution. Not because I had gained something unexpected, but because something false had finally been removed. I thought then about how my mother used to speak about fairness, not as balance between people, but as alignment between intention and outcome. And for the first time, I understood what she meant. The story didn't end with confrontation or apology or even admission. It ended with clarity. And sometimes, especially later in life, that's the only ending that truly lasts. After everything was settled, life didn't dramatically change. It clarified, and that quiet shift mattered more than I expected. There were no announcements, no moments of correction delivered out loud, no visible turning point anyone else could point to, and yet things were unmistakably different. Conversations adjusted on their own. People spoke more carefully around me. Assumptions that had once been made without hesitation no longer surfaced so easily. My brother and I didn't argue. We simply spoke less, and when we did, the tone had changed. Not warmer, not colder, just careful. He never apologized, and I never asked him to, because apologies offered after outcomes are decided rarely heal what led to them. What surprised me most was how quickly peace arrived once I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. The quiet I had carried for years, mistaken by others for passivity, finally felt like something I chose, not something placed on me. I returned documents to where they belonged, resumed routines that had been interrupted, and noticed how grief began to move differently once it was no longer tangled with injustice. It became slower, more private, less sharp. There were moments when I thought about what might have happened if I had reacted that first night. If I had argued, demanded, tried to defend my worth to someone who had already decided it, and the thought passed as gently as it arrived. Because nothing I could have said in that moment would have done what patience eventually did. My brother moved on too, adjusting to a reality that no longer bent around his expectations, and I learned that distance doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it simply means things have found their proper place. What stayed with me wasn't satisfaction or relief, but steadiness. The sense that my mother's intentions had been honored quietly, that the years I spent showing up without recognition hadn't disappeared just because someone tried to speak over them, and that dignity, once preserved, doesn't ask for proof. I didn't smile at the end because I had won. I smiled because I no longer needed to.